So there we go. We've talked about some examples of sexual conflict. So one of the things that we want to think about is something called strategic interference theory, right? So the idea here is that there are sort of ways that you can block the strategies and violate the desires of someone else, right? So if you are a male, your strategy is let's have sex as early as possible in this relationship. If you're a female, your approach is let's have sex much later in this relationship, right? And so how do you sort of block and interfere the other person's approach to this, right? And again, it's because of these different sexual strategies that you're going to do this. You can't simultaneously have sex early in the relationship for the first time and have sex later in the relationship for the first time, right? Those two things can't happen at this, right? Because there's some difference there. So how do you do this, right? How do you use a strategy to either sort of shift that sexual encounter earlier, or how do you delay that sexual encounter to later, right? What are the ways, the strategies that you can do for that, right? We're not necessarily going to think about something maybe specific there, but we do want to think about that in general, right? Again, with this theory, we're thinking about this. This would occur when members of one sex, or that they have these different desires, different approaches, right? Okay. And there's some idea that what we would consider a negative emotion, right, is going to be something we could use to solve this strategy, right? Okay. So we could use jealousy, anger, rage, distress that can alert us what is causing the source of this interference, right? And what are things that we can do about that. Okay. We think about these as negative emotions typically because we're going to think about them as positive emotions, but we put negative in quotes because we want to think that even though they are negative, they still may help us resolve an issue or solve a problem, right? So we can do that. Here's like the weirdest diagram I've ever seen to demonstrate. It looks strange. It looks strange, doesn't it? Basically, what it says is men want to have sex earlier in the relationship, women want to have it later. And for some reason, they decided to do it with these bulbs and arrows. I don't know. I just don't know why this diagram was even necessary. It just doesn't. I don't know. It's one of the lighthearted moments for today. So hold on to this as much as you can because it just goes downhill from here. It's one of those. Krista, what kind of review have you left for this class? Because I've already seen it. Then I bet you're glad this is the only class of mine you're going to take. I get that feeling sometimes. All right, so hey, here's like a real problem though. And we've talked about this before, right? We talked about this a few chapters ago toward the beginning of the semester. We talked about your ability to infer the sexual intent of another person, right? Don't raise your hands. I just want to throw that out there. But how many times have you had a situation where someone has had a different idea about your sexual intent than you had, or you had a different idea about someone's sexual intent than they did? It happens. It happens all the time, actually, right? It's a pretty common occurrence. Now, what happens next? Right, the next step is the serious step, right? The like, oh, I think that person wants to have sex with me step is not really that big of a deal. That person did activity A, B, or C, that becomes a bigger deal, right? Or I did A, B, or C to that person. That becomes the bigger issue, right? Not necessarily that you think someone wants to have sex with you or they think that you want to have sex with them. That's probably not... it's probably not that uncommon, right? So the thing to take away from this is that men will often or sometimes infer sexual interest on the part of a woman when it doesn't really exist, right? And why would men be more likely to do this than women, right? And you're going to give me probably a lot of surface sort of answers to this, and there are a lot of surface answers that can get you somewhere, right? We could talk about testosterone levels, we could talk about cultural socialization, we could talk about a few things, right, that could get you there. But fundamentally, if we get down for this class, in particular, if we get down to that evolutionary strategy and we start to think about the mating strategies of men versus women, right? The male mating strategy is typically take advantage of short-term mating strategy or take advantage of short-term mating opportunities when they're presented, right? And then if you can maintain a long-term relationship as well, or instead of. And the problem is for men, if they miss on an opportunity to mate, right? So for men, they don't want to miss opportunities, right? So they will be more likely to have a false positive, right? So they would be more likely to infer some interest just in case. You never know, right? Just in case this turns into something, I'm gonna, maybe pursue that or be inclined to think that that's something that could happen because I don't want to miss this mating opportunity, right? Females, on the other hand, are less likely to infer this sort of sexual interest. For females, I mean, they have a sort of a different reproductive strategy, right? It's short-term strategies. We talked a little bit about that, but they're going to be more choosy, right? Because again of that obligatory investment. And so you're not going to just go, oh, that guy smiled at me, he wants to have sex, let's go ahead and do that. That's not going to be on average the response that you have. Men, on the other hand, will often infer smiling as an indication of sexual interest, right? So I'm going to tell you, never smile at anybody. Just walk around frowning all the time. Now everybody's going to try to, right, when they do smile, there you go, right? It's kind of funny to watch people's behavior after you tell them something. But actually, there was an interesting story in the book, Mary. I don't know if you remember the one about the grocery store that started the like let's really be super great at customer service and smile at everybody. The problem really, the thing really backfired because then a lot of the female workers started filing sexual harassment charges against the customers because they were smiling so much. Naturally, the guys assumed, like, I'm just buying potatoes. If she's smiling at me that much, she definitely wants to have sex with me, right? I mean, that's a reasonable inference, I think, right? I mean, why not? But speaking from an evolutionary perspective, right, if you're a male and you have any sort of positive interest at all, you're going to think, well, maybe, not really interested in a long-term relationship with the, cashier at Kroger, but, if she's willing to carry around a half copy of me for 9 months and then take care of it, I don't have to do anything. That's another copy of my DNA out there floating around. Sounds exciting. And so over an evolutionary time period, that small advantage that might give you to sort of infer that there's some interest, can really be pretty powerful, right? Because think about the times, you don't raise your hands, please. If any of you are in a long-term relationship, and I know a few of you that are, let's think about those times. Like maybe that person did smile at you once, right? And then what if you hadn't what if you'd gone, well, smile, whatever, and then you hadn't sort of underneath of that inferred, like maybe there's some other interest there. Where would that have gotten you? Like nowhere, right? You'd still just be walking around lonely. So there you go. Thankfully, somebody far back in your ancestral tree thought smiling was, indicative of sexual interest, and on average, it's worked. What does that mean for some of the folks sitting in this room? I'm not telling you don't smile, because I still think you should. But for the others of you, I would say, like, just because somebody smiles doesn't mean they're really interested in you. Like, keep that in the back of your mind all the time, and your life will be a little easier, right? You'll get slapped less often. The police will show up less often. You'll do stupid and harmful things less often, okay? So a smile is just a smile, and I guess that's my Freud ripoff. Sometimes a smile is just a smile. That was a good one, wasn't it? Right there. Josh is writing that one down. I don't mention Freud in class if I can help it. But sometimes you have to. Right. All right. So any questions about that? Okay, do you have a question or you just... Okay, that's fine. Uh, should we talk about jealousy? Oh, not yet. I thought this was because there was a study of jealousy, but this is a study of folks in the United States and Brazil. Not too big of a deal. Basically, what they're doing here is they're looking at again these judgments of sexual intent, and they were asking individuals, if you looked at a male, if you looked at a female, and you tried to judge their intent. In general, across all cultures, men judge women to be more sexually interested in the person they're interacting with if they show some sort of friendliness toward that individual than females who watch the same sort of interaction. So if you have you're watching a video clip, excuse me, of a man and a woman interacting, if that woman is friendly, if she smiles, men will be much more likely to indicate that she's trying to be seductive or sexy than the female would be if she's watching that. If there are females watching that, they'll rate that intent a little bit lower. That just goes back to that. Just because somebody smiles, it's just a smile. Maybe they just had their teeth whitened. They just want to show you. It's like, I got a good dentist. I don't know. All right, what's something else that folks will do? Deception about commitment. Again, please don't raise your hands. Today's like a whole day of don't raise your hands, but I want you interested anyway, right? So think about raising your hand, but just don't. Just kind of, right? I just don't want you to go like, yeah, I've deceived women all the time about my commitment. Do it every day. Please don't raise your hands on that. But deception about commitment, right? Men are more likely to repeat or report that they have deceived women about their level of commitment in a relationship, right? Again, if we go back to that ridiculous looking diagram, if men are more likely to indicate, if a man seems more committed, women are going to be more likely to allow them sexual access, right? And so men will often do different things. You can think about what those things might be, right? To appear to be more committed to a relationship than they actually are. So that's something, right? So because of that, women actually have this sort of what they call a commitment skepticism bias, right? So again, please don't raise your hands. But how many of you have ever been in a relationship, particularly we're thinking about females in this case, have been in a relationship and you've doubted the commitment of the other individual? Yeah, that's pretty common, right? Happens all the time. Men don't tend to doubt the commitment of the women in the relationship, or they don't doubt that as much. They do some. They're more concerned later, and we'll talk about emotional versus sexual infidelities. And so there's sort of a little split on jealousy. We'll talk about that later. But women in particular, because they primarily rely on those long-term mating strategies, are much more interested and much more likely to be skeptical about the commitment statements from their partner. So if you're going to try to deceive women about your commitment, try to be really convincing, right? So really work on that method acting so you just really come across as really committed to the relationship. See, these are great tips, right? And for the women out there, there's you should learn how to read like real facial expressions, right? Laura, what do we know about people when they actually smile? If it's a real smile, corners of the eyes come down, right? And so you can kind of look at the validity of that particular facial expression. It's actually difficult to fake a real facial expression. Questions about that? I mean, so there you go. Later we'll talk about all the fun things that women do to try to get men to be more committed than they actually are. Mary, that's going to be an exciting conversation, right? We're getting ready to talk about deadbeat fathers trying to skip out on having kids, and then we'll talk about manipulative mothers trying to get their partners to stay. So I try to be equally derogatory in this class. I hope I do a good job. I hope I do that. If not, Krista, you can put it in your review. What about sexual withholding, right? I think this is, again, we're thinking about things here that are sort of stereotypical, but one of the interesting things in this case is that when we hear stories about, men complaining about women withholding sex, you consistently hear that over cultures and over time and over individuals. You start to think, well, maybe there is a little more There's actually something to this, right? Let's see. So men tend to be more bothered by sexual withholding than women. Don't think that probably comes across as a real surprise to individuals, but there are actual numbers, right? That's kind of the exciting thing about this class. We don't just talk about like, hey, this is what we think. We actually go out, people ask questions, and then they get an answer. Even if you think you already know the answer, sometimes you don't actually. There's some interesting times where you think you figured out the answer and you don't until you ask the question. So men tend to be more bothered by withholding sexual access than women do. Again, this goes back to that mating strategy, right? It's kind of that fundamental difference in approaches. We should talk about sexual harassment and sort of evolved defenses against sexual aggression, right? So this is kind of an interesting thing to think about in some way. Most of the victims of sexual harassment are women. At least the reported complaints are more likely to come from women. Here's just sort of a cherry-picked example there. There are a few other examples. Here's one for federal government employees. 42% of federal government employees that are women experience sexual harassment, which is insanely high if you think about that, right? Like over half of the women who work for the federal government are victims of sexual harassment. That's pretty appalling. I mean, if you really think about it. 15% of the men who are in this study of 10,000 individuals, they experienced some sexual harassment as well. Now, this might be a couple things. I mean, that's still 15%. Still seems like a high number, right? I mean, it's like you'd like to see that number at 0, right? I mean, it's kind of the ideal there. I think there are a couple things to consider here, though. One of these is that there was a separate study where they asked individuals, how would you feel if you were, if you were harassed by a coworker, right? And so women are typically, 63% of women said they would actually be insulted, if they were approached by another individual and asked to have sex with them when it was a coworker. So you're in a work situation, somebody just walks up and says, hey, do you want to have sex with me later? 63% of women are going to be kind of outright offended by that. But only 17%, as actually should be men. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, 17% of women are flattered. It's almost the exact opposite for men. I think it's 15% would be insulted if they were men. I don't remember the exact number of percentage of men, but it's about 70% of men are flattered. And again, that goes back to that sort of simple difference in these reproductive strategies. Unfortunately, men will use sexual aggressiveness, right, to minimize the costs that they incur for sexual access, right? So men will force sex on women. They will do all kinds of things without permission, right? Again, one of the problems with this strategy for men is that there are issues with retaliation and damage to reputation, right, which is a particular issue. I think we're all aware of that. I mean, I don't think this is anything too surprising. I think one of the things that's really interesting, though, is that, not surprisingly, most people don't want to be forced to have sex, right? I mean, I think we got a handle on that. What's interesting, though, is the way that men and women think about the impact of forcing sex on another individual. And I think this is where there's a big discrepancy and sort of an area where we can actually work on some things. Women rate being forced to have sex as very high. Like on a 7-point scale, sexual aggression is rated at like a 6.5, right? You can't really, on average, get much higher than that, right? And so if you were to go ask a number of women on this, 1 being not so bad at all and 7 being the absolute worst, how would you rate, sexual aggression? Where would you put that on the scale? On average, 6.5. I mean, that's right up there at the top, right? If you ask men this, right? If you ask men, what how would you rate? How do you think women would rate this, right? How do you think women would rate sexual aggression? How bad do they think that is? Men actually rate this much lower. They rate it like in the 5s, right? Still, they realize like, hey, that's pretty bad, but not like as bad, right? And so I think that discrepancy is an important discrepancy, and I think sort of closing that gap is actually important, because I think as two groups of people start to rate the behavior the same, then they both recognize the full impact of that behavior on other individuals, right? When there's a difference in that rating, then one group doesn't necessarily, on average, see the full impact of the actions, right? I think that creates a problem where they're not as aware, and so I think, in my mind, that's a particularly sort of important thing to get across, right? Like, hey, that's probably a lot worse than you think it is on the person you're doing it to, so why don't you fix that? Put that on a brochure, Krista. You can just write that up. That was great, wasn't it? In the reverse, men typically rate sexually aggressive acts by women to be quite low. That's like a 3 on a 1 to 7 scale, right? It's sort of like innocuous. It's not too big of a deal, like whatever. And in fact, I know you might not. I know that's, Krista, puzzling to you apparently. That just goes back to, again, that short-term mating strategy, right? I mean, men are going to want to try to, mate with as many people as reasonable from an evolutionary perspective, and so this is not something that's going to bother them quite as much. All right, now's the fun part, right? When you start talking about like rape adaptations. So there are a couple sort of schools of thought about rape adaptations. And the problem is, this is a very difficult thing to study, right? It's a very difficult thing to study for a variety of reasons. And one of these reasons is that it's, there aren't a whole lot of people coming forward like, yeah, I was raped, let me just tell you all about it. Or, hey, guess what? I raped somebody, let me tell you all about it. Right? Those two groups of people, maybe they're not really sharing a lot of information, right? For different reasons. Okay, so that makes it complicated. The second thing is, talking about this is even a difficult thing, right? And doing research on this, there's a great book a number of years ago that was written called Galileo's Middle Finger, which is a great book title. Anybody read that book? I irritated some of you about reading it, I think, at some point, because we had a book club on this. This particular book looked at individuals who were doing research on things that were sort of controversial topics, and the data they were collecting didn't quite match the popular story, right? And so that happens, particularly with sexual assault and sexual behaviors in general, are like a whole group of behaviors that are sometimes controversial. People don't really like to talk about them. One of the individuals was doing some research for research about transgender individuals, was looking at some of the motivations and the issues that those individuals were experiencing, the way that they were thinking about their transitions and so forth. The information he was getting did not really match up with the popular trans rights movements at the time, and so he was sort of shunned by that group, was sort of pushed out to the side. He brought some problems on his own, which tells you the complicated nature of people in general, and he created his own issues later in his career. But it also lets you know, like, sometimes there's a difference between like what's right and what's good, right? Or sort of truth and justice are not always the same thing, and that's a particularly interesting sort of concept to take here. There was a guy who wrote a book a number of years ago, and he is cited in your textbook. He wrote a book called The Natural History of Rape, which is it was Randy Thornhill. He wrote that. He actually he wrote his book mostly about like insects and things, right? He wrote like about scorpion flies, who have this sort of odd like genital clamp. I don't really know what else to call it. Yeah, and it's only used in specific instances where the male scorpion fly is actually raping the female scorpion fly. It's not used in their normal sort of reproductive encounters, where the male scorpion fly will bring a what's called a nuptial gift. So basically it brings another dead insect over. It's like, hey, take a chomp on this grasshopper. If you like what I brought you, let's make some more scorpion flies, right? I know, right, Miriam? It's just kind of fun things to think about, right? Scorpion fly sex. So there you go. So he wrote this book. I haven't read the book. I just want to be clear about that. There were a lot of individuals who really criticized his book because his argument was more about rape being a sex act and about sexual access, and it was really kind of denying or did not focus on the like power differential sort of aspect of rape. And at the time and still now, that's sort of the predominant narrative, right, that people focus on, which I think is fine in one sense, that is a narrative that is focused on, but ignoring other narratives and other information that's available is really going to lead you down the wrong path, right? And so I think about this when I think about big problems we've been working on for decades and centuries and we haven't fixed yet. And you think about, well, why haven't we fixed that? And sometimes because we've ignored a particular body of knowledge, right? I think addiction is one of those things, right? I think over the years we've ignored particular domains of knowledge. And I think that's one of the reasons we're so far behind keeping people off drugs and helping them once they get on drugs to stop using those drugs. I think sexual assault and violence is another issue where we've sort of ignored a particular body of knowledge for some period of time, and it's really held us back on prevention programs and so forth. So I don't know if that makes sense to anybody. That's my take on it. It's not to say we shouldn't think about other things, but we should think about this as well, right? And sort of incorporate that. All right, so there you go. Questions about that? No, that's pretty good, right? So this is where it sort of gets a little fuzzy, right? And you think about there are these two sort of rape theories, right? There's the rape as adaptation theory, like we evolved rape as a mechanism because it solves some adaptive problem, and then there's the rape as byproduct theory, right? Like it just happened because of other things. And if you remember, we had a similar sort of thing about homicide, right? We talked about, is homicide something that's really an advantage and we adapted that as an advantage, or was it just a byproduct of this other sort of behavior that we had, and sometimes we kill people, right? And so it's the same kind of concept here, right? And so here's this great guy Thornhill and his buddy Palmer, who caused the big stir a number of years ago, but they said there's really sort of 6 things that might have evolved in the male mind that would indicate that there is a rape as adaptation. One of these is being able to assess potential rape victims, right? The vulnerability of those rape victims. Most of the women who are raped are in that like 20 to 30-year-old range. They're kind of right in there. Once you get about, and even for sexual harassment, once you hit about 43 years old, sexual harassment sort of just drops off, right? There's not as many issues with sexual harassment, right? And if you're thinking about this as trying to get access to, to that reproductive resource, that would make some sense. Postmenopausal women would not be as heavily targeted for that. There does seem to be, they would think there would be what we call a context-sensitive switch, right? And so you would look for those fertile rape victims, particularly if you were not able to get consenting partners, right? Because if you are trying to send your genetic material forward, you're not able to do that through some sort of consensual approach. You might try to do that through force. You would think that there would be a higher sperm count during rape than there would be during consensual sex, right? If this was the case. There would be some arousal in men to female resistance to consensual sex, and in cases of marital rape, there would be again a higher. There would be some instance of where this would be considered sperm competition. So the idea here is when we're talking about sperm competition, I don't think we've really talked about this too much here. If there's more than one person's sperm sort of floating around, you want to try to displace that or put more sperm in than somebody else, right? So that your sperms are more likely to be the one to fertilize an egg, right? And so there are some very in other species, some very interesting approaches to sperm competition, including like barbed penises and so forth, right? I thought that might have been a lighter-hearted moment, but we're kind of down in a hole right now. Nobody got excited about that. That's okay. So there are some other things, but there's some argument that marital rape could be considered sperm competition. Now, if it's this sort of byproduct idea, then we would think that why would it be a byproduct? Well, there is the male desire for sexual variety, right? That's something that's been sort of clearly demonstrated. You could see where rape would be a byproduct of that, right? Just because you're seeking sexual variety means you would be seeking sex with multiple partners, different partners, and so you might have that. Definitely sex without investment, right? That's a pretty strong motivator in men, over the course of the history of our species. And be looking for those sexual opportunities. And then in men in general, we have some capacity to use physical aggression to achieve a variety of goals, right? Over the course of the history of our species, physical aggression, we talked about that last week, right? Using physical aggression to solve problems, right? That is a thing that happens. And sexual access is really just another problem. I don't want to make light of the effects of how some people go about solving that problem, but it really is just another evolutionary problem, like an adaptive problem, right? And so if this strategy of physical violence or physical aggression has worked to get me food, it's worked to get me shelter, it's worked to protect me from other attackers, well, why wouldn't it work to get access to, a fertile mate? So you can kind of see that's what this sort of byproduct idea is, right? It's not that men specifically have some, like, oh yeah, rape is definitely an adaptation and that's been great and that's helped us all move along. It's, well, physical aggression helped with other things, so we'll just apply it to this same problem, right? What's the saying? Everything's a hammer if you hit it with, everything's a nail. Everything's a nail if you hit it with a hammer. Something like that.
The hammer's the only tool anything looks like a nail.
Yeah, whatever, right, Paul? Yeah. Basically, if you hit everything with a hammer, well, that's what happens. How does that saying go?
If the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right. So if the only tool you have is physical aggression, everything looks like a nail. I don't think that's the right one there. So that's, but you get the point, right? Great. What about this is kind of an interesting thing, right? So there was a group of researchers who asked men, and this was kind of the same question we talked about last week, and they said, hey, here's the deal. We're going to let you rape somebody, and there's absolutely zero chance you're going to get punished for it. No negative outcomes at all for you, right? And so they asked a group of men, and they said, hey, what's the likelihood that in that situation, in those circumstances, you would actually do this? 65% of men said zero, like they wouldn't do it at all, right? 65% of men were absolutely not. Even under conditions where there's no chance of retaliation, no chance of any reputation loss, no chance of any punishment, 65% of the men who were surveyed in this case said absolutely not, I would still not rape someone. That makes sense, right? 35% of the men indicated that there was a chance that they would. Now, I know that still sounds like a high number, 35%. But most of these indicated only a small likelihood, right? Like that they actually would. Not like, yeah, I absolutely 100% definitely going to do it. Most of them were like, well, maybe there's like a 5% chance that I would in that case, or something, some small likelihood that they would. So the overwhelming majority of men, under any circumstance, would not rape a woman, right? And so I think that's something that when you're thinking about, is it an adaptation or is it a byproduct? If the overwhelming majority of men won't do it, where do you think that falls? Josh, maybe you have some. You think it's adaptation? You think it's a byproduct? We don't really know. That's the problem, right? We don't know. And again, Mary, because we don't have a whole lot of data on this, and it really becomes difficult to ask people questions, we're not getting a whole lot closer to the answer, right? We're getting a little closer over time, but we're not really making leaps and bounds on this, right? Part of the problem with that is we still have a very bad tendency to blame victims and shun victims of sexual assault and rape and sexual violence, and sort of put the onus on them, right? And really think about what did you do wrong, what could have you done differently, how does this change you as a person, rather than realizing like, hey, you didn't do anything wrong here. This is some other idiot's fault, and we should probably work on that instead. But until we get away from that sort of thinking about things, it's going to be difficult. Partner rapists, right? So somewhere between 10 and 26% of married women have been raped by their husbands. That's a pretty high number, right? I mean, you think about like 1 in 4 almost. This again is that sort of sperm competition idea. It actually is quite recent that actually the married women can actually be raped by their husbands, right? In some states, for a long time, this was not something that was considered criminal. So, kind of a bad situation. All right. Here's sort of an interesting thing. Individuals that are higher in perceived mating success and have actually had sort of, experience going from no sexual experience to physical coercive experience are more likely to indicate that they would use sexual coercion. So there's sort of this idea called the mate deprivation hypothesis that indicates that individuals who don't have sexual experience or who aren't able to get access to sexual mates would be more likely to use some sort of coercive mechanism to get a mate, particularly we're talking about males here. But that doesn't really, this is one of those times where you thought you knew the answer, but then you asked the question and you really did know the answer. Because you would anticipate that men who, right, so you'd be more likely, men who could not get access to women would be more likely to do this. But in fact, it's women, or it's men who have actually been more likely and indicate that they think they're more likely to have access to women that are more likely to use physical coercion to obtain a mate or obtain a mating opportunity. Something to think about. What about anti-rape adaptations, right? So again, if over the course of our evolutionary history, women have had to face sexual assault and rape, which I'm going to go out on a limb here and say they have. They face that now. I don't see why it would have been any different millennia ago. It seems reasonable, right? What are the things that they might, what are the adaptations that they might have to sort of protect against that, right? One of these is what we would call like special friends, right? So relationships with other males or alliances with other males that would offer you some sort of protection, right? This is sort of an extension of the idea that one of the number one factors that reduces the likelihood of partner violence of any kind, whether that's sexual or physical violence, inflicted upon a woman, is the closeness of her kin, right? So having your extended family close to you sort of protects you against this particular thing that can happen. So having the ability to convince others to enact some sort of retribution or retaliation, right, is definitely a deterrent. Okay, right. That's like you never pick on the guy who's got the older brother in the same school, right? That's not smart, right? Always pick on the guy that's got the younger brother, because the younger brother can't do anything to you, right? Nobody's got it. Makes sense to me, right? Yeah. What about mate selection? We've already said that women prefer larger, dominant men, right? Socially dominant men. This could be a way to deter other men from sexual aggression, right? Just sort of intuitively, there aren't a lot of people. Let me think of a great example. How many men out there do you think would try to commit sexual aggression against someone who's mating with The Rock? It's a good example, right? And that's a guy who's physically and he's got some physical size and social dominance, right? I think The Rock's pretty high there on both of those categories. It's not going to happen, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense. Why? You know why. It's an obvious answer, right? You don't have to really think about it too much. So that's kind of what they call the bodyguard hypothesis, right? So you mate with someone who's bigger and stronger, and they can be your bodyguard to prevent others from sort of attacking you. You create female-female coalitions, right, for protection. Women will do that as well. And there are particular sort of fears that women develop that could help them avoid these sort of situations. Most women tend to be afraid of what we call outgroup men, right? You won't spend a lot of time with a man that you don't know, with a male that you don't know, if you're alone with that individual, right? That's something that you would sort of, even just thinking about it probably makes you feel just a little weird, doesn't it? Kind of start to think like, I don't know that guy. I'm not going to ride in a car for 2 hours with a guy I don't know. Does that seem like something anybody would do? No, it doesn't, right? It's just, and you sort of intuitively realize that's not something you should do until you get to know that individual. Interestingly, women are this is sort of really interesting. They avoid risky activities during ovulation, right? And so while you're ovulating, so this is one way you can tell if you're ovulating. See how you feel about walking down dark streets at night alone. If you're like, this isn't so bad, you're probably not ovulating. If you are ovulating, you'll be less likely to do that. I don't think that's exactly how it works, but you get the idea there of sort of those extremes, right? So that's kind of cool. Jealousy. How many of you have felt jealous before? I'm not even going to look up because all the hands should go up, right? Nobody's raising their hands, but Miriam, it's everybody, right? Okay. It's not a problem. I mean, it is a problem how you handle it. It's not a problem that you feel it, right? Because there's nothing you can do about it. So why would we sort of develop this concept or idea? Why would we have jealousy, right? And then of course it's the feeling is one thing, but it's what you do with that feeling, right? What's that behavior, right? What's that behavioral output? And there are a few things that we have jealousy for, and it's to one, fend off mate poachers. I mean, if you spend a long time trying to attract a mate, maintain a mate, get that person to spend a lot of time with you, the last thing you want is somebody else to swoop in and take it. I mean, that seems like waste of effort, right? So we're going to create some jealousy there. You want to deter sexual infidelity, right? Again, we've always said in this class, the only thing worse than raising your own kids is raising someone else's kids, right? We've decided that. So keep that in mind. And then you do want to retain a mate for the long run, right? You want to have that kind of long-term mate. Now, extreme jealousy is, let's just be honest here, bad, right? Extreme jealousy is highly correlated with physical and sexual violence, right? And so if you have an individual who is extremely jealous and acts upon that, you'll often see that that's someone who you probably shouldn't be spending a lot of time with. Now, some jealousy that you feel, and then maybe some of the lower level things you might do because of that jealousy is a completely different situation, right? And that's kind of maybe might fall within those normal acceptable behaviors. Let's see what we've got here, right? So we've already talked about jealousy. It really gets kicked up when there's a situation where someone might be unfaithful, right? You're going to be extra vigilant. Right? So how many of you, and you don't have to answer this, right? How many of you have gone to let's think about going to a party with your partner, and there are a number of individuals, either male or female, who might be interested in your partner? How much closer did you walk to your partner? How much tighter did you hold that person to you, right? Did you leave that person's side more or less often than in a situation where you're, let's think about you took your partner home for Thanksgiving, and that's probably a situation where you're not as worried about, your grandma like sliding in on your new boyfriend or girlfriend, right? There you go, Krista. That's the image for the day. You were just waiting on this, right? Like, when is this class going to take a turn for the worst? And that was it right there. But there are times, very similar context, right? You're hanging out with your family, lots of other people around. You don't care if your partner goes off and talks to your mom or your dad or your aunt, your uncle, whatever, right? You're not really too worried about that. You go to a party with a bunch of your friends or maybe even like acquaintances. You go to some kind of, maybe you go to a bar or something. You're not going to let your partner get too far from you in those cases, right? You're going to stay much closer to them. Makes a lot of sense, right? So there you go. Definitely want to kind of curtail the partner's contact with others if you're jealous, right? Now, is it a bad thing if you're at a party and you're hanging close to your partner and you're just holding them a little closer and you're kind of giving them a little more attention? That's probably not so bad, right? But when you've told them they can't leave the house and they got to stay home and they can't talk to anybody, then we've crossed the line, right? We're pretty far over a line then. So that's where jealousy can go from something rather benign into something quite serious pretty quickly. And you should kind of keep an eye on those things, right? Okay. It'll also, jealousy will cause you to like do things sometimes that you might not want to do, right? So you'd increase your own efforts to fill someone else's desires, so that your partner's not going to leave, right? So we sort of think of a benign example here. My wife goes to baseball games with me. She hates baseball. She doesn't. She just goes and watches the guys play the drums, right? Like they always have like the little like in between inning entertainment, right? The mascots jump around. That's what she enjoys. You know, I'm there trying to watch a baseball game and really try to enjoy something. She goes, she watches games on TV with me. Has no real interest in baseball at all, right? Is she doing that because it gives me less reason to stray? Well, I mean, this is a pretty extreme example, right? I probably wouldn't get too upset if she was like, I'm not really watching this game today. But again, that's a benign example, right? How many of you have sort of picked up a hobby, or you've gone to a movie, or you've done something, kind of right because your partner said, yeah, that's what I want to do, and you're like, geez, really? Again? How many seasons is Downton Abbey? Too many. It's the same thing over and over again. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I watched like a third of those episodes. So I couldn't tell you. So there you go, right? So those are sort of low-level examples. But there are times where individuals will start to do things that are unhealthy, right? They'll start to do things to try to conform to the other individual's ideals. The other person may even say, if you don't, start wearing only a shoe on your left foot, I'm going to leave you. I just think of a ridiculous example, right? And that's a little eccentric, but but you can see where this can quickly become something that's sort of gets out of hand quickly, right? And you will often, this will happen, particularly men, will threaten others, other individuals to kind of, fend off would-be sexual rivals, right? So somebody else kind of looks at your partner, and you get in their face and you have some sort of physical altercation with them, right? And maybe sometimes, right, Paul, a smile's just a smile, right? Maybe you should just let that go. You don't have to get too worked up about it and try to throttle people because they're, showing excellent customer service at the grocery store, right? I can imagine like how many husbands got mad at the males. That was the thing that wasn't mentioned in that particular story. Like how many of the men who were like, we're never going back there, that stupid cashier. I could just see that conversation happening in the car on the drive home. And the wife was like, well, I thought he was just nice, just buying some eggs, whatever. I don't know. I don't know. I think about these things. You guys don't. I don't know why. I'm just sitting around and I'm like, what would happen there? So here's the kind of interesting things. Differences in sexual jealousy, right? Or sex differences in jealousy. So, not surprisingly, men are really jealous around individuals who have status and resources. Why? Women are looking for status and resources, right? So men should be like, hey, that dude's got more money. I better watch out. I need to be jealous now. I need to try something to, make sure she doesn't leave me for her boss, right? Because he makes more money than I do. Trying to make a normal story there. Women are more jealous around individuals who are physically attractive, right? So, let's say you have a female friend. You're a male. Female friend's really attractive. Your current partner might be more jealous of that person or around that person than would be someone who, maybe someone who's less attractive but more wealthy, right? Because again, women are tuned to know men are looking for younger women, right? Younger, attractive women that have those signs of fertility. Not too surprising there. This is sort of a complicated graph, but really here's the story. Men are more likely to be upset over a sexual infidelity. Women are more likely to be upset if there's emotional content, right? Women, so if you're a female and your male partner has sex with another woman, that's obviously going to be very upsetting. It's going to be much more upsetting if he was also emotionally invested in that individual, right? If it was simply a sexual encounter, you're not going to get as worked up about that. Why? Because he's still going to be contributing his long-term resources to you and to your offspring, right? That was a short-term mating situation. He was just trying to toss a half copy of his DNA out there in the world. He did what he did, and we're just going to move on, right? Men, on the other hand, are not as likely to be concerned about the emotional aspect, but they are concerned more about the physical aspect, right? Because they could end up raising someone else's child. They're going to be very sensitive to that. You know, I'm investing all my time and resources into something that's not mine. Particularly pregnant women are sort of prone to be the recipients of jealous behavior and physical violence, particularly if there's some extra reason to increase the uncertainty of paternity. Right, so women who might have been unfaithful at some time in the past, or maybe their behavior would indicate that they are going to be more likely to be sort of abused by their partners than individuals who are not pregnant, right? All right, so here's like a bunch of charts. You don't have to worry about that. What about mate retention tactics, right? Men. More likely to conceal a partner. That doesn't mean you're hiding a partner from your partner. That means you're hiding your partner from everyone else, right? Miriam, why would we want to hide our partner from everyone else? Let's think about if we're a crustacean and we're going to take our female crustacean and cram her back in a hole, right? And we're going to keep other males from her, and that's going to keep her from having someone else's little baby crayfish, right? That's kind of the point. So if you conceal your partner from others, she can't have sex with them, and any offspring she has are definitely yours. Okay. Again, spend all your free time with your partner, right? What happens if your female partner spends free time with someone else? Well, they're definitely having sex. Because that's what you would be doing if another woman was spending her free time with you, right, Ashley? I mean, that makes sense to me. So that's exactly what these people are thinking. They're going to be more likely, men are more likely to resort to threats and violence, particularly against other rivals. And they are more likely to use what's called resource display, right? That means buying your partner jewelry, gifts, taking her out to expensive restaurants, right? Anybody in a relationship, you don't have to raise your hands, but let's think about this. Or think about the relationships you know of. Who buys the better gifts? Yeah, right, Josh? I saw that face. I saw that face. You're thinking like, that was the last thing she got me. But I just bought her, you know. So that's a pretty typical story. I mean, it's such to the point that I mean, when we talk about, you know, like, let me ask this: how many of you know of a woman who's bought jewelry for a man? Yeah, right, Miriam. A wedding band is one thing. That's not really jewelry.
Just raising my hand.
Oh, okay. Oh, I thought you were like, look at this. It's a wedding band. I'm like, that's a whole different sort of symbol we could talk about. But there are times when women will buy jewelry for men, but not as often as men buy jewelry for women, and it's not as expensive. Typically, men will spend more on jewelry for women than women will spend for men. Jewelry is a perfect example because it's useless. It serves no real, like, it doesn't solve an adaptive problem, right? Like buying someone food, buying them a house, buying them something practical. Jewelry's not typically practical, right? I mean, there's no real practical purpose there, other than to display to other people, look at this, I've got resources, I bought her nice stuff, you can leave her alone, she's going to stay with me. Women use other tactics. Right? They will do things particularly related to their appearance. Again, we've said, you know, men are more interested in appearance than women are on average, right? And so women are more likely to do things to sort of, in quotes here, make them extra attractive. That's why I was shopping with my wife the other day, and she was commenting about how fashions are like, things that she saw as a kid are kind of coming back into fashion now, right? There's always this kind of like movement back to things. I don't know, whatever. Kelly, I think you're a perfect example wearing a Friends t-shirt today, right? So that's sort of a highlight of that particular phenomenon. And I was like, I think if I bought a men's suit from the 40s, it would be the same men's suit I would buy today, right? I mean, they haven't really changed that much. Like men's clothes, it's like, well, you get pants, you get a shirt. I mean, button-down shirts, they have buttons, they have sleeves. I don't know. My great-grandfather probably wore the same shirts. I mean, the design's not really changed. But for women, it constantly changes, right? And that changes a lot. Actually, my wife just got glasses. They had like 2 pairs of frames for men. They had the black square pair, and then they had a round pair. And then they had like racks of pairs of glasses for women, right, with these different frames. They really had like 4 times as many women's frames as they did men's frames. It was really interesting. They had like one like 4-sided rotating thing for men. They had one of those for women, and then like 3 walls of frames, and they were all in different colors and styles and lens shapes. I don't know. So again, that kind of makes some sense. Women also do a few other, and you got to watch these manipulative women. They do a few other things. I know I'm getting a lot of angry stares, Josh. I don't know why. I thought by this point in the semester, Laura, everyone would know not to take me seriously. But I guess it still hits a few people right there on some buttons, right? I'm glad I can still push buttons. That's always a fun skill. Women are more likely to flirt with other men to increase jealousy, right? Don't raise your hand. Anybody ever done that one? Nobody's going to raise their hand because I told you not to. They also will show other, interest in other men. They'll try to talk to other men to try to get their current partner to sort of escalate their commitment level, right? Because that's the whole point here, right? Women are wanting these long-term commitments. Men are just wanting a uterus with an egg in it. It's kind of get down to that fundamental level there, right? Okay, I mean, we might as well say what it is, right? So I know, right? When you leave this class, I think like your whole worldview has changed. Like you used to think people were awesome and love was great, and it's like, no, just looking for an egg with a uterus with an egg in it. That's it. There you go. Huh? It is. Paul, be careful.
It's not that bad.
Okay, it's not that bad. He starts with, it's not that bad.
I've actually had conversations with my girlfriend about like things we're learning about.
You got to be careful on that, but okay.
Sexuality and everything else, and she's like, "Us, what you're saying is trash." That's like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disagree with that. I mean, we're talking about the evolutionarily average man, right? Not you individually.
Yeah.
You're a wonderful, shining example of the male sex, Paul. I just wanted to say that. You're welcome. It's everyone else that's horrible, right? You're pulling up the average. Actually, it'd be even worse if it wasn't for you. You're an outlier. Yeah, probably not, right? I mean, you're much closer. We're probably much closer, men and women, much closer to the average than we want to admit, right? We're not all from. I can't even use this because he's got problems too. But I'm going to use it anyway, with no endorsement of Garrison Keillor at all. We're not all from Lake Wobegon, where everyone's above average. It doesn't work that way, right? You guys have had stats. Somebody's got to be below average. Right, Jason? That's how you get an average, right? Right? Some people are above it and some people are below it, right? And that's how you get there. You guys don't know Lake Wobegon, so I don't have to go through a big explanation of that. There's a guy, his name was Garrison Keillor. He got in some trouble recently for some sexual harassment charges. Yeah, I know, right? And so this was after he retired from a Prairie Home Companion. It was a radio program, right? Which makes me feel really old. And it was an old-time radio program that has been running for decades. He always talked about like Lake Wobegon, where everyone was above average, and everybody was just great. And it was kind of this effect where when you think about things and you think about people you know and who you are, you always think everyone's above average when in fact somebody has to be below average somewhere. Otherwise, the average would be higher, and then just people still be below it. That's the weird thing about averages, right? Even when you move them, people are still below it. So there you go. Women, they do some things for mate retention, right? Don't worry about this too much. This is just giving you examples, right? So not surprisingly, women who are younger and more attractive will have husbands or mates who are more likely to participate in mate guarding tactics, right? Men who are sort of low on the good genes indicators of mate value will be more likely to participate in mate guarding or mate retention efforts when their partners are ovulating, right? And that makes some sense too. Because when your partner's ovulating, what should you do if you do have an egg in your uterus? You should find the best quality mate possible, right? Genetically speaking. That doesn't have to be the best mate possible to give you long-term resources if you can convince that current partner that you have that egg was fertilized by him, right? So if you're ovulating and you can get some good DNA from somewhere else, but you can get the good resources from this individual, it's a win-win for you, right? Right, Ashley? I mean, this is the way this works. It makes perfect sense, right? Why would you not, right? This is why they make swirl ice cream. You can get chocolate and vanilla. You can just get the best of both worlds. You get the good DNA and you get the good resources, right? And so if there's an individual who's low on the DNA side, while you're ovulating, that individual is going to be participating more in these mate retention activities. So there you go. It's not too surprising, right? Ovulation. So when women are ovulating, men are going to be more likely to do this. That makes a lot of sense. Again, the folks on the low side of things are going to be more likely to participate in mate retention efforts. Men who have higher income or status striving are going to be the recipient of mate retention tactics from their spouse, from their wife, right? Makes sense, right? If you are looking for resources and upward mobility in society, you're going to try to keep your hands on that person who has those resources and that upward mobility, right? It's really pretty straightforward. Here's a graph that indicates that. What about violence? Violence toward partners is never acceptable. I hate that I have to put that disclaimer out there, but there it is. Right, so a lot of this is related to sexual jealousy. Again, we already talked about that. The higher the sexual jealousy, the more likely the wife is to be the recipient of abuse, right? Particularly when it's related to infidelity. That is going to really drive up the likelihood that the husband's going to commit violence toward the wife. This was sort of an interesting, I don't know. I'm going to talk to Mary about this because no one else read the book. Although, Paul, you may have read the book.
I read most of it.
Most of it.
It was harder to read.
This chapter was harder to read, right? It was. So there was an interesting sort of argument at the end of the book about patriarchy, right? Did you read that part? Which I found really fascinating. And there's really, I think, a lot there to think about, right? And and you have to be careful how you talk about this, right? Because you don't want to start blaming. I don't want to go it's women's fault there's patriarchy, because that sounds like a bad thing to say. Probably because it is a bad thing to say, right, Katie? But by the same token, why do men in most societies have more resources than women, right? Well, one contributing factor to that, and there are a multitude of other factors, but one factor to consider: why would men want resources? Do you know why men want resources? Because they want women. And women want resources. So, Krista, if men have acquired a bunch of resources, they're going to be more attractive and more likely to be able to reproduce, right? So over time, men are going to be trying to gather up more resources, and they're going to approach that more aggressively and with more vigor than if women were I don't really care if he's got resources or not. The poor guy is just as cool as the rich guy. But nobody's ready to say that just yet, are they? Like, all else being equal, poor guy or rich guy, what's the answer? You guys know the answer, right? So there you go. Which I thought, again, was really just a fascinating sort of spin on things and a way to think about things. Again, this in no way says, we should keep resources from women. This in no way justifies paying women 60 or 70% of what a man makes for the same job. This in no way does that. It's simply a factor to consider when we're thinking about why this happens. And then what can we do to fix it, right? What can we do to get some more equality, which is really kind of fascinating. I don't know. I thought that was actually kind of cool. The other thing to consider, and this was, again, the guy who wrote this book, he's an old white guy, and he kind of falls into like old white guy thinking sometimes, right? Which happens. It even gets the best of us, I guess. We'll find out if that ever happens to me. Thank you, Michaela. That was a nested joke, and I don't know that everyone had the intelligence for that, but you did. I appreciate that. See, I gave you the punchline first, and then I told the joke, and it was in the reverse order. But you caught it anyway. That was brilliant. We're going to give you some imaginary bonus points for that. So.
I wish they weren't imaginary.
Yeah, I do too. It'd make my grading easier, but if I gave everybody enough bonus points to get an A, I'm just done with the class.
You can just do that.
I
You have the power.
I do, but I have the ethics not to. So the point of this is he has a slight criticism of feminism and feminist thinkers in there as well. He kind of like nests that in there, right? It's kind of and while I would say like, well, we probably shouldn't do that because we get faces like this made at us. His critique is actually valid, and it's actually something to consider. There are often, hang in there. You're not, but your face is. Your face is really doing a lot. So his comment is that when you think about a lot of feminist literature and feminist thinking, it's kind of like all men are unified together for the oppression of women. Right? And in fact, from an evolutionary perspective, that makes no sense at all. All men should be for the oppression of everyone else who's not them. Right? And in fact, all men should be competing against each other to try to get resources. Not all men are like, hey, you know what? We should just get all the resources and buddy up on that. That doesn't make any sense. If I can get all the resources, I'm getting all the resources because then I get access to all the reproductive opportunities. Why would I want to share those with you? You don't have my DNA. Right? The only rare instance when that might happen is if you happen to be somebody's brother. And then you're like, well, okay. That's like the Brothers Khan. You guys don't know about the Brothers Khan? Genghis and, what was his brother's name? It left me. But there's some idea that those two individuals are responsible, like maybe 1% of the population today, like 1 to 3% of the population is a descendant of those individuals. Which is, if you consider, I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but what's the percentage of individuals who are a descendant of your father? That's like point however many zeros you can think of, and then a 1, right? It's pretty low. Even if you have 6 brothers and sisters, right? It's still pretty low, right? But these guys, you're doing the math. Josh is over here doing the math.
210 million?
Yeah. So that's the idea is that so how did these two individuals get access to all these women? They raped them all. Is the short story. They came in and they conquered and they killed off all the men and then they raped all the women and that was kind of the end of that story. It wasn't a great story. It was whatever it was. But that's the idea that they between the two of them they had maybe 1,000 offspring, like direct offspring. Is sort of the estimate, which is quite sizable when you consider that. So anyway, that's the story about the Brothers Khan and sexual assault. It actually kind of fit. Surprising. Questions about this? I'm going to get 0 hands going up, except for maybe Paul. No, Paul doesn't even have anything. That's when you know you've given a good lecture. No, seriously, are there questions? We're not going to judge you too harshly. All right. So what really should you take away from this, right? Again, sexual violence and assault is never acceptable. There is a conflict between male and female sexual or reproductive strategies and mating strategies. Because of that, each of those groups has a set of adaptations to try to get, to try to carry out their strategies, right? And the other sex has a set of adaptations to sort of prevent that from happening, right? We've talked about the commitment skepticism bias in women. We talked about, deception in men. We've talked about jealousy. We talked about all these other things. I think this is really a nice extension of those first few chapters that we talked about those different approaches, and hopefully this kind of brings it all together. I hope it explains why there are so many problems with sexual assault and sexual violence, or at least gives you some extra insight into why that happens. Again, in no way condoning that, but just thinking about it from a different perspective and maybe thinking about different things we can do to work to prevent that, educate individuals on what they're doing and what they should be doing differently. All right. Questions, comments, concerns? Nobody has any questions.